Over the years, I've often had prints made to illustrate my talks. And what I did was to add the frame or border in Photoshop's layers. I then asked the printers to create a borderless print for me. Remember, my frame is going to be printed on, so from their point of view, they're creating a borderless print. The techniques we can look at here are good for high quality prints, but also for digital projected images too. The techniques are also quite a fun way to gain a bit more experience on how layers in Photoshop works. We can use Photoshop's layers to create the matte effect. Now, this 3D effect is so convincing when it's printed that I've seen people at my talks running their finger over the edges of my print to feel what they think is a genuinely stepped matte frame, when all it is a drop shadow and it's printed directly with the image. We can work to precise sizes if we have the need, but here it's the technique that's important. The image you can see on screen is quite a high resolution one. Let me go to Image and Image Size. And there you can see it's 8,700 pixels by 5461. And in inches, it's something like 30 inches by 18. Let's start by removing the lock in the layers on the right-hand side. By just clicking the lock, what we're effectively doing here is separating the canvas from the image, and that allows us to increase the canvas size but not the image size, creating our border. Let's go and select the crop tool from the toolbox on the left, and what I'm going to do here is just drag out the corner toggles, and you can see how we're now increasing the canvas size but we're leaving the image the normal size that it started as. I'm going to make the bottom border a little bit wider than the sides and the top. When I'm happy with that, I can hit Done up at the top right, and then if I select my Move tool from the top of the toolbox, I can click on the picture and just make sure it's nicely central. I want the border to be much the same at the top, left and right, but a little bit wider at the base. So there you can see, by removing the lock in the layers, we've separated the image from the canvas and we've increased the canvas. So we've got now scope to create the border we want. Now, before we get into producing the matte effect, let's just create a border here that's in harmony with the image. If I go down to the bottom of the layers palette, I can click the little plus and create a new blank layer. Now I want to create my border on this layer, so it needs to be beneath the image so the image sits upon it. Click drag and drop will do that for us. The next thing I'd like to do is to see how the image is going to look if I selected a tone from within the image. So if we go to the toolbox once again and we select the eyedropper tool, the options for the eyedropper tool are not important here, but I want a fairly darkish sort of colour, so let's pick one of the dark blues up into the sky. You can see that appear as the foreground colour in the colour picker on the left hand side. Now I need to flood that blue into the layer we have selected on the right. Probably the most effective way of doing this, and it is a keystroke, but it's a keystroke worth remembering, Alt backspace. Now as soon as we see the colour that we've included in the border, we're going to start making an evaluation. Does it look okay? Is it too bright? Is it too colourful? Well, we can change this as many times as we wish and in a number of different ways. One of those is to bring up the hue and saturation palette. We can find that in the image menu, adjustments, hue and saturation. Control U is the shortcut. I'll put this in the center. So here what we can do is to take a bit of saturation off of that border, and maybe we could choose to darken it a little bit. So we've still got a hint of blue from the image, and it's starting to balance a little bit better with the image. If the image was really brilliantly coloured, I would probably go much darker, even to black, because a really strong coloured image looks great against a black background. But here, of course, there's lots of personal choice, and of course we could affect the hue as well to see if there's a difference there that we would like. But I think it was about right when it was around 0, so let's put it back there somewhere. And I'm going to click OK to that. Let's select the zoom tool now and just ask to see this at 100%. So we can scroll to the corner and see the image and the border. Perhaps that's a little bit large. I'll just drop it down a little bit. There we can see the border. So what we could do here is add a little bit of texture. One of my favourites is noise, but there are a myriad of them to choose from. Just remember, try not to make your border stronger than the image you're framing. So filter, noise, add noise. Having the image this size gives us a better opportunity to judge. Here it's 5% of Gaussian monochromatic noise. I think that may be a little bit on the heavy side. Let me drop it to 3. It's much more delicate. Again, lots of personal choice. So I've even got a delicate texture within that border. Control 0 will fit the image back on screen. The only thing we may want to place around the outer edge is the thin line we talked about in the previous video. Now we can do that by selecting the image itself in Layers, going down to the Effects tab, and here I'll just bring up the blending options because we've got loads of them and we can select any one of these. But if I go to the stroke command, when I tick it, it'll automatically give me the edge effect that I last used. But to get to the options to make a change, we also need to click here to highlight this tab. Now all of the settings appear in front of us. So I want the position to be on the inside of the line. You can see it's high resolution. We've got 8 pixels forming that thin line. Let me drop that back to about 5 and see how that looks. That looks quite delicate. And of course, by clicking the color panel, I could change the color, but I think a mid-tone, something like that, is going to work pretty well. Now try not to immediately send this off to the printers to be printed. Save this as a Photoshop file, because sometimes when we're working on our computer, the common sense part of our brain is often overpowered by the creative part of our brain. We sometimes need to leave something overnight, come back and look at what we did yesterday the next day, because then our mind is clear, and if we've made the wrong choices, generally we can spot them. But once we're happy, we could flatten these 2 layers together and send this off to the printers to have a print made and the border appears with the print. For the matte effect, I'm going to use a much lighter image because I think it will show the effect much better and we can see how it's applied. I've already removed the lock in the layers on the right hand side, and I could use the crop tool as before, but there is another way. If I go to image and canvas size, I can, let me look at this in inches, because what I'm going to do here, I'm going to add 3 inches to the width and height. I can do that pretty easily. Well, maybe not 3, 6, because I want 3 either side. So let me tick the relative box and say, give me 6 inches on the width, so I'm going to get 3 either side, and give me 6 inches on the height. And OK. Now you can see the border is quite large there, but for demo purposes and in the interests of keeping the video short, let's run with that. I need my magic wand tool. So I'm going to select the magic wand from the toolbox, And I'm going to click into that area around the outside edge of the flower. Coming back to the layers on the right hand side, I'm going to create a new blank layer above the rose, and I'm going to flood that with black. Now I don't have black in the colours in the colour picker on the left hand side. I can go down there and click that little double-headed arrow to switch them, and I can click the little black and white square to return them to black and white. But the D key does it automatically for me, and that's quite useful at times. And now I can flood that selection with black using Alt backspace. The selection stays in place, which is a good thing, because I want to go back down to the bottom of the layers and to create another new blank layer. Now here I'm going to flood this with white. We could choose an off-white from the image, but let's just go with white. White in the left-hand side of the screen in the colour picker is the background colour. Control backspace will flood with white. Now we can remove the selection. We can do that from the select menu at the top of the screen. Control D will do it much quicker. Now let's select the black layer here, because this is going to form the shadow. We're just going to blur this, and it's going to give us the drop shadow effect. So with the layer selected, we can go to Filter. I'm going to go to Blur and Gaussian Blur. There's lots of different blur effects here. But there you can see straight out of the box there's a radius of 31.8, but it doesn't look too bad there. I'm going to click OK and accept that. Now that drop shadow effect, which I was mentioning right at the start of this video, is what I've seen people on my physical prints running their fingers over to see if they can feel the indentation, which of course isn't there. But it doesn't end here, because we do have some options once we've created the shadow. In an image like this, which is very pale, we may want to take off some of the impact of that shadow. Maybe it's a little bit too heavy for us. One of the ways we can do that is with the opacity of the layer. If I go to this option and I just drop back the opacity to 50%, you can see we still get the effect of the matte, but it's much more delicate and probably a little more in keeping with the image we have on screen. If I required a little bit of delicate colour into the main frame, which is currently white, I would select it in layers first, go to the toolbox on the left and pick up my eyedropper tool. Let's pick that delicate pink around the edge, and then I could go back to my layers and lock the layer. Why am I locking the layer? I'm locking the layer to make sure that when we flood the frame around the outside edge, we don't flood the middle as well. That lock protects it. So pink is my foreground colour, Alt backspace is the shortcut key. So you can choose, do we like it to be slightly off-white, a little bit pink, a little bit like the image, or do we want white? You can see you have lots of options here. There's just two of them. Supposing I want to put a very, very thin line around the inner edge of that opening to the image. To do that, we can select this layer and hold the Control key and just click this thumbnail. There you can see we've actually got the selection remade. You can see one around the outer edge, one on the inner edge. Well, shortcut keys again, but perhaps I'm hitting you with too many of those. Let's go to Select, and what we want to do here is inverse the selection. So all it's doing now is just picking out the edge we want. But let's not put the line on the actual frame itself. Let's create another new blank layer. What we can do here is flood this with black or a grey colour. Edit, Stroke. I want to choose the inside. Let's start with 4 pixels. and I'll choose a fairly dark black. We can always back away from it a little bit later. OK, Control D will remove the selection. And there you can see we've got a very delicate line. We can do a number of things with that. We can easily recreate the selection and drop the intensity of the colour or tone. But of course, because we've got that line on its own layer, I've got the opportunity to drop the intensity down using the opacity. So using layers, we can create a really great matte effect that's so convincing when it's printed, you'll find people will try to feel for it. Now, on some occasions when I'm working with this technique and darker images, sometimes the shadow layer that we've got over on the right here needs to be a little stronger. Incidentally, can you see a little light line that appears to be at the top edge and the left-hand edge? Don't worry too much about this. If I pick up my zoom tool and zoom in, you'll see it disappears. It's just one of those weird things how our screens sometimes show us things that are not quite there. Just be aware of that. But what I was about to say was, you can see the drop shadow here, but it's nowhere near as effective as the lighter image. So one way to achieve that is we can make a copy of this layer. It's already been blurred, so we've already got the making of the matte. So I'm going to recreate this with Control J, and there instantly you can see the drop shadow is doubled up. But of course it doesn't even end there, does it? Because if adding 2 layers is too much, I can always then temper one with the opacity to get exactly the effect I want. And finally, if I need a line around the outer edge, I can do that too. So here we can see a delicate line around the outer edge of the image, or sitting on the inner part of the frame, and of course we can add any texture we please to the frame, but keep it delicate. Great effects in Photoshop, and I'll see you next time.